On July 14, 2026, 74-year-old Dennis Michael Sochor was executed in Florida after 37 years on death row for killing a woman hours after meeting her at a New Year's Eve party. He died by 3 drug injections, making him one of the oldest death row prisoners in history. His execution brought an end to a case that had haunted investigators and Patricia Gifford's family for more than 4 decades. Patricia's body was never found, yet the evidence and the testimony of those who witnessed parts of the events left little doubt about what had happened. Before we explore this case, I invite you to take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below letting us know where you are watching from. Your support allows us to continue producing in-depth, respectful documentaries that honor victims and highlight the pursuit of justice. Long before Patricia Gifford disappeared, Dennis Sochor had already shown a pattern of violent behavior that should have kept him behind bars. In March 1980, a woman whose identity has never been publicly released became the victim of Dennis Sochor. According to court records, Dennis forced her out of a cocktail lounge in Fort Lauderdale and into a vehicle. He drove her to an isolated location where a camper was parked and indecently assaulted her. Unlike many victims, she managed to escape. She immediately contacted law enforcement and led officers back to the camper where Dennis was still present. He was arrested at the scene. Later that year, he was convicted and received a sentence of only 1 year in jail, followed by 5 years of probation. Although the sentence would eventually be overturned and replaced with life imprisonment in 1987, the original punishment meant Dennis was free only a short time later. Still on probation, he returned to society despite already having a history of indecent assault. Authorities would also later learn he was wanted in Michigan for another similar attack. Less than 2 years after his release, another young woman crossed his path. 18-year-old Patricia Marie Gifford looked forward to celebrating New Year's Eve in 1981 with her friend, 22-year-old Delta Harville. Patricia's boyfriend had to work that night, so the two friends decided to welcome the new year together at the Banana Boat Lounge in Broward County, Florida. They arrived around 9 p.m., expecting nothing more than an evening of music, dancing, and celebration. While sitting together at the bar, they met two brothers, Dennis and Gary Sochor. Gary had recently traveled from Michigan to visit Dennis in Florida, and the brothers spent much of the evening talking, laughing, and sharing a drink with the two women. According to later testimony, nothing during those early conversations suggested the nightmare that would follow. At one point during the evening, Delta snapped a photograph of Patricia smiling with Dennis standing behind her. The picture seemed like an ordinary keepsake from a New Year's celebration. Instead, it would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation after Patricia vanished. As midnight arrived, the crowded lounge celebrated the beginning of 1982. Hours later, around 2 a.m., Delta became ill. She had just one drink. Patricia, along with Dennis and Gary, helped her outside to her car. Unable to drive, Delta lay down inside the vehicle and quickly fell asleep. Rather than ending the night there, Patricia worried her friend was not yet capable of driving home safely, so she returned inside the lounge to pay the bar bill. On her way out to stay with her friend in the car, she was kidnapped. Delta was still asleep in the driver's seat. Patricia Gifford was pulled into Dennis' employer-owned work truck, sitting between the two brothers. Dennis headed toward a secluded area far from the city. Once there, he forced Patricia from the truck and into nearby woods. Gary later testified that he initially remained inside the vehicle. Soon, however, he heard Patricia screaming. Alarmed, he walked toward the wooded area and shouted at his brother to stop. From a distance, Gary even threw a rock in Dennis' direction, hoping to interrupt the attack. According to Gary, Dennis became enraged and screamed for him to return to the truck. Frightened, Gary obeyed. Sometime later, Dennis emerged from the woods alone. The brothers drove back to Dennis' house, where Gary was dropped off before Dennis left again by himself. Later that morning, Gary walked to the truck to collect some personal belongings before preparing to return to Michigan. Inside, he discovered several items belonging to Patricia, including a shoe, her sweater, and her keys. When Gary confronted Dennis about the belongings, Dennis immediately grabbed the items and disposed of them. They were never recovered. Gary also watched as Dennis thoroughly cleaned both the interior and exterior of the truck, carefully removing anything that might connect him to Patricia. Meanwhile, Delta eventually woke up inside her car in the Banana Boat Lounge parking lot. Patricia was gone. Realizing something was terribly wrong, she reported her friend missing and told investigators about the two brothers they had met the night before. After the film from her camera was developed, detectives obtained the photograph showing Patricia with Dennis standing directly behind her. The image was released to local television stations as police appealed for help identifying the man seen with the missing teenager just hours before she vanished. Dennis was watching television with his roommates when the news report aired. As soon as he saw Patricia's photograph and realized police were looking for him, he reportedly jumped from his chair, hurriedly packed his belongings into his employer's work truck, and fled before investigators ever reached his home. By the time detectives arrived, Dennis had already disappeared. His roommates described exactly what they had witnessed after the television broadcast and provided investigators with information about Gary, who had already returned to Michigan. When contacted, Gary immediately cooperated with authorities. He disclosed everything he had witnessed that morning, including Patricia's screams, Dennis' violent behavior in the woods, and the personal belongings he later discovered inside the truck. Gary agreed to return to Florida, retraced the route the brothers had driven with detectives, and assisted investigators in their growing search for Patricia Gifford. While police intensified their investigation, Dennis Sochor had already begun a year-long life on the run. After fleeing Fort Lauderdale, Dennis Sochor abandoned the life he had built in Florida and disappeared before detectives could question him. His sudden departure only strengthened investigators' belief that he was responsible for Patricia Gifford's disappearance. Using his employer's work truck, he drove across Florida to Tampa. Once there, he abandoned the vehicle, eliminating one of the most important pieces of evidence that could connect him to Patricia's disappearance. He then boarded a bus to New Orleans before eventually settling in the Atlanta, Georgia area. For more than 4 years, Dennis successfully avoided capture. During that time, Patricia's family continued searching for answers while investigators pursued every lead they could find. Despite extensive searches, there was still no sign of Patricia or her body. Without physical evidence, the case remained painfully unresolved, although detectives remained convinced they knew who was responsible. Everything changed in May 1986. While living in DeKalb County, Georgia, Dennis was stopped by police after running a red light. Officers also suspected he was driving under the influence and arrested him on the traffic offenses. During routine booking procedures, authorities discovered that he was a wanted fugitive from Florida. Broward County detectives immediately traveled to Georgia to question him. Faced with overwhelming evidence and years of living as a fugitive, Dennis Sochor chose to confess. During recorded interviews, he admitted abducting Patricia Gifford after leaving the Banana Boat Lounge on New Year's Day 1982. He acknowledged taking her into an isolated wooded area where he assaulted and murdered her. He also revealed that he had transported her body into the Florida Everglades and disposed of it deep within the swamp. Investigators hoped the confession would finally allow Patricia's family to recover her remains. Then Sochor attempted to guide detectives to the location where he claimed he had left her body. Search teams spent days combing remote areas of the Everglades using officers, boats, and search equipment. But the Everglades is one of the most unforgiving landscapes in the United States. Vast wetlands, thick vegetation, deep water, and countless alligators make locating human remains extraordinarily difficult. Despite the extensive search, Patricia Gifford was never found. To this day, her body has never been recovered. Dennis also admitted during questioning that he was wanted in Michigan for another violent assault on a woman before moving to Florida. Investigators learned that Patricia's murder was not an isolated act, but part of a disturbing pattern of violent crimes against women stretching across multiple states. His case proceeded to trial in Florida in 1987. Because Patricia's body had never been found, the defense centered its strategy on one argument. Prosecutors could not prove she was dead. They suggested there was insufficient evidence to establish murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution, however, presented an overwhelming case. Jurors heard multiple recorded confessions in which Dennis admitted killing Patricia and disposing of her body. Prosecutors also called Gary Sochor, whose testimony became one of the most significant pieces of evidence presented during the trial. Gary described the events of New Year's morning in detail. He testified that he heard Patricia screaming from the woods after Dennis forced her from the truck. He recalled yelling for his brother to stop and even throwing a rock toward him in an unsuccessful attempt to interrupt the assault. Gary further testified that after returning home, he discovered Patricia's shoe, sweater, and keys inside Dennis' truck. When he questioned his brother, Dennis immediately destroyed or disposed of the items before thoroughly cleaning the vehicle. Additional witnesses included Dennis' former roommates, who described his panicked reaction after seeing Patricia's missing person report on television. They told jurors how he hurriedly packed his belongings and fled before police could arrive at the house. The jury rejected the defense's arguments. Dennis Michael Sochor was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and several related offenses. In November 1987, he was sentenced to death for Patricia Gifford's murder. Over the decades that followed, Dennis Sochor remained on Florida's death row while filing numerous appeals. Each was ultimately denied. As the years passed, another question continued to surround the case. Why wasn't Gary Sochor prosecuted? Florida prosecutors reached a different conclusion. Investigators determined there was no evidence that Gary helped plan the crime, participated in the assault or murder, assisted in disposing of Patricia's body, or knowingly helped Dennis escape afterward. More importantly, Gary became the first witness to fully implicate Dennis. Prosecutors ultimately concluded that his cooperation was essential to securing a conviction, and that the available evidence did not support charging him as an accomplice to murder. In 2026, after exhausting every legal appeal, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Dennis Sochor's death warrant. More than 44 years had passed since Patricia disappeared after celebrating New Year's Eve with friends. On July 14, 2026, Dennis Sochor was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. His execution closed one of Florida's longest-running death row cases. When asked by the warden at Florida State Prison if he had a last statement, he apologized multiple times, thanked his own loved ones for their years of support, and concluded by commending his spirit to Jesus.